in the Department of Geography this year. He spent years studying in archaeology and heritage management within the university, government, and the private sector. He finished his MA in archaeology here at Memorial University in 2017 and worked as a GIS technician for the town of Happy Valley Goose Bay in Labrador. Most recently, he's become a PhD candidate in archaeology at UiT, the Arctic University of Norway in beautiful Tromsø, Norway. His PhD deals with the archaeology of 20th century single industry mining towns in Russia, Norway, and Labrador, about which I'll be talking today, and which of course you can see the connections with my interests in mineral development and mining communities. In both his free and professional time, Anatoly likes long walks through beautiful landscapes devastated by modernity, and I can say that he's also a great forager and wildcrafter. So also some activities somewhat dear to my heart, although I think I'm a rookie compared to Anatoly. But he truly does know the way to a supervisor's heart when he showed up at our first face-to-face meeting with a nice jar of dried chanterelles. It was really very thoughtful. So if you want to know where to snuffle out the mushrooms, here's your man. And I think most of them are safe and non-psychoactive, but I cannot totally guarantee it. So today Anatoly will be speaking on why Lab West reminds me of Soviet Russia, the heritage of 20th century single industry towns. Please welcome Anatoly.
All right. Well, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. Thank you for watching the recording online. So first things first. I learned this from Scott Nielsen, who's over at the School of Arctic and Subarctic Studies. Instead of putting acknowledgements last, when you're all tired of me and want me to shut up, it deserves to be first. This is more pertinent now, I think, than ever. I mean, it has always been. Research doesn't exist in space, it comes from somewhere. And I wouldn't be here today, physically even, without the people, the institutions, the social and the academic and the economic ecologies I find myself enmeshed in. And for that, I am extremely grateful. At the same time, and in addition to acknowledging kind of the people and the organizations, I would also actually like to add to Evan's land acknowledgement from a few minutes earlier, and also acknowledge the Skolt Sami from northeastern Norway, and the Kala Sami from the interior of the Kola Peninsula, which part of my work is on, as well as the North Sami, on whose traditional territories I usually reside in Tromsø, or no, Tromsø, as it's known in Norwegian. So here's an outline of my talk. I will briefly introduce kind of the broader research project that I'm a PhD in. And then I will talk about the Kola Peninsula and also Norway, which is my third case study, added because, actually because of the COVID pandemic and difficulties in travel. And I'll spend most of my time talking about Labrador West, what I did this past summer. I think that might be of most interest to the people here. And finally, kind of the question of, well, where am I going from here? So I'll start with, so I'm part of this research group called Unruly Heritage and Archaeology of the Anthropocene, started by Bjørnar Olsen and Thora Petersdottir and run out of UiT. And the best way I can introduce that project is by putting up UNESCO's definition of what heritage is. Heritage is our legacy from the past, what we live with today and what we pass on to future generations. This is a very inclusive definition. It covers things like archaeological sites and historic buildings and intangible heritage practices like languages, traditions, and skills. However, there's also an uncomfortable fact that in the last little while, the sort of heritage we have been leaving behind has grown more and more problematic. Industrial ruins, waste repositories, ocean plastics, and even the cataclysmic concentrations of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere is all a legacy of the past. It is all our heritage. And it is a very heavy heritage that will continue for countless of generations up to the point where there might not even be humans, but our legacies will remain. So how do we shift our perspective on heritage kind of in line with UNESCO's definition, where, instead of valuing kind of a few select things and actually speak honestly and inclusively about this sort of heritage that is involuntary, that we have to live with because it is impossible to escape, and how does that change the role of people who work either in heritage management or in heritage-related fields, which there are many. So that is the sort of questions that my research group tries to answer. So where do I fit into this? Well, as Arne mentioned, I'm a graduate of Memorial University, and right after I finished, I moved to Labrador to do GIS. And down the street from Happy Valley Goose Bay was Labrador City, where it's a nice place to go to Walmart and McDonald's. It's only a 5-hour, 6-hour drive, it's fine. And it's, but it was kind of peculiar and strange because it had these, well, very nice houses and very nice lawns, and a very nice mall. And the towns existed for iron mining and to support the iron mines. And when I started looking at what would become my research group and their work on the Kola Peninsula, that also had a heritage and a geography, I guess, a human geography of single industrial towns based upon mining. This was interesting, but then thinking more about it, not only there's this transatlantic connection, but the kind of the built environment on the Kola looked somewhat familiar to my hometown in Riga, where I was born in the twilight years of the Soviet Union as part of the privileged Russian minority, which was very different from the native Latvian population who had their own cultural, historic, and linguistic identity. And at the same time, Labrador City, well, that that kind of urban landscape of single-family homes reminded me of Texas, where I grew up as a teenager. Why is that? Well, don't hold your breath, the answer is colonialism. Done. You can leave now. But beyond that, there was a northern resource-based colonialism that produced single industrial towns in economies and political systems that were very different from each other. And there was a transmission of urban planning principles, of attitudes towards nature and waste, towards indigenous people, and towards even utopian dreams of creating a settled, colonized North. So different economic and political systems produced fairly similar types of heritage formations. And Sør-Varanger municipality too, which is there in eastern Norway, was also, as I'll expand upon a bit in a few minutes, was also a a really nice community built upon the Norwegian, like a Nordic welfare state model. So let's talk about Russia. And you can't talk about Russia without the statue of Lenin. So the Kola Peninsula is in the northwestern corner of Russia. Russians have been visiting it since the Middle Ages. First missions began there in the 1500s. But for the longest time, it remained as a periphery of the Russian Empire, predominantly occupied by the indigenous Sami. That changed in 1917, well, first with the railroad, then the revolution, and that brought up rapid industrialization and militarization. Militarization because of the strategic importance of the Arctic Sea, industrialization because the Kola is full of actually a very complex geological heritage, and there was also a need to have a self-sufficient economy. The Sami reindeer herds were collectivized, and the Sami were resettled, sometimes several times over kind of the Soviet period, to make way for military bases and hydroelectric developments, and of course, mines and mining towns. My work particularly focused on Monchegorsk, which is kind of right in the middle of the Kola Peninsula. Monchegorsk is the second single industrial mining town, or mono town, on the Kola. It started in the 30s for nickel and copper mining and smelting. Big strategic resource, very important for the military, but also industrial applications. The ore reserves ran out in the 70s, but the smelting continued. It's in fact even now slated to become one of the largest nickel processing plants in the world. Meanwhile, the urban landscape is pretty Soviet. This includes these large, grand, neoclassical Stalin-era houses, and well, mostly a lot of these, the mass-produced concrete panel block apartments, which was a very good way of cheaply providing houses for the population. So kind of the Soviet materiality is still part of the urban landscape of Monchegorsk. At the same time, the edges of the town reveal the heritage that got tossed aside kind of as part of the environmental, economic, and social shifts. This includes the ecological heritage and the astronomical amounts of sulfur dioxide tossed out in the 70s and 80s. This includes abandoned houses and buildings. The population of Monchegorsk declined by 40% since the early 90s. And there's just infrastructure that's left over, including quarries, and there's some Soviet nostalgia for you right there. So there's kind of an all-encompassing, a lot of all-encompassing Sovietness in the town. To introduce my Norwegian case study, Sør-Varanger municipality, it's located in northeastern Norway, and it's kind of comprised of several communities, but specifically Bjørnevatn was the iron mining town, and Kirkenes was the processing community and the harbor. It's located in the borderland region where, for centuries, Norwegians and Russians and Finns and Sami kind of interacted on the traditional homelands of the Skål Sami. And a lot of the reason why the mine was subsidized for a long time was to solidify a Norwegian identity in an otherwise ethnically mixed borderland. The mine started in the early 1900s, iron mine, But the towns were destroyed during the Second World War. This was the part of the Arctic front of Operation Barbarossa. The towns and the mine was devastated. And after the devastation, the Norwegian state rebuilt Kirkenes and Bjornevatn with 87% of government ownership. And some of it, the town is actually acknowledged for being like significant heritage, like the workers' houses. And yet at the same time, there's a lot of informal heritage and voluntary heritage. The Sydvaranger mine closed in 1997, briefly operated in the early 2000s, and since 2015 it's been shut down, and now there's like a hope that it will one day reopen. There's hope for it every year, still waiting. But this creates a unique landscape of semi-abandoned quasi-ruins, including the inoperable mine, the buildings, the equipment. I would be remiss not to say that there is also some heritage in the area, like this boathouse, but you really have to go out of the way and know what you're looking for in order to find it. So here, more than anything, you see kind of a mesh and splitting of what is valued and protected, as opposed to everything else that people must live with, the objects, the infrastructure, the buildings, and the waste, because it is too big to get rid of. And there's also hope it will get reused sometime in the future. Finally, we get to Labrador West, which specifically for me consists of Labrador City and Wabush, as well as Twin Falls. So to provide a bit of historical background to those who don't know Labrador West, first of all, everyone should just stop this video on YouTube and go watch Orin 54 to get the creation story. So yeah, in 1945, there was this iron ore crisis in the United States. They're like, oh my God, where do we get more iron? Well, it turns out the big friendly country next door. So there was a massive undertaking to build a railway from Saint-Ile in Quebec to Schefferville. It was the 414 kilometers. You'll find more in the video. And later, kind of on the Labrador side of the border, there was Labrador City and Wabush, two towns because two different companies. Labrador City started in 1960, Wabush in 1962. And the built environment consisted of detached homes, duplexes, row houses, also, and a lot of it was followed the Garden City movement, including using muskeg for excellent lawn base. And however, creating settled, stable communities had some challenges here, as it did in the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, the big change took place in 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union and rapid introduction of the market economy. Here, there was a major crisis in the 80s. There was a sharp drop in iron, and already the companies pulled less support from the communities, and now there's been a shift to also kind of the global mining companies, which minimize the importance of small resource-based communities like this, and yet they persist. And to borrow a term I've heard Arn use, they're been riding the resource roller coaster, the boom and the bust cycles, the switch to more reliance on the fly-in, fly-out labor, and etc. And like in Russia, we have a built environment that was put up quickly, borrowing architectural and urban design principles from southern regions, and putting them into different climates. And we have a material culture and an urban environment that was built in one political and economic reality and has to be adapted to another. Examples of such shifts and adaptations, you can see like the Wabush Mall, that's mostly empty now, especially because of the short multi-year shutdown of the Wabush mines. The town has not yet recovered, even though the mine has restarted. And another wonderful example is the Hairy Lake subdivision. That's a trailer park subdivision, it's very large. It was started in the 70s as a temporary solution to get more people housing. And yet it has now become a permanent fixture in the community. Parallels to this can be drawn to Khrushchev period apartment buildings in the Soviet Union that were built in the 50s and 60s. The idea was that these apartments would last from 25 to 30 years before the arrival of complete communism. We're still waiting for complete communism, but the houses remain long after their best before dates. So a lot of my work, kind of previously in all the countries, and especially this summer, has focused on, as well as kind of the urban environment, has also focused on the peripheries, on kind of the material impacts that make up the infrastructure and everything else that went into supporting the communities today. One area that I spent a significant amount of time are the sand pits behind the town of Wabush, where a lot of sand and gravel and also muskeg for the lawn base got harvested. And now they still persist as a collection of pits and quarries. And there's a lot of jumping ramps, there's a lot of fire pits, which I mapped twice in 2019 and 2021, which allowed me to track changes over time and to draw out some conclusions about the auxiliary impacts of building mining towns and kind of how the leftover spaces invite reuse and reoccupation within within a disused, I guess, landscape, even though it's not actually disused. The focus on infrastructure, particularly, was also really big because there's a web of infrastructure that really extends past just Labrador City and Wabush or any of the mining communities. That really also extends the geographical scope of the impact. This is one of the best examples is the railway, and some of it has been abandoned because of shifts from railways being the main mode of transportation to now paved highways. In fact, it can be argued that a lot of infrastructure, current and non-current, like highways and railroads and cell towers, TV towers, radio, has been linked to this desire to help overcome the perceived feelings of isolation and the materiality of distance. One stark example is all of the airstrips. I visited 7, which is probably not, there's way more than that. And the sheer amount of runways in Western Labrador is a unique feature, both kind of among my case studies, but also a unique feature in the geography of this province. Their presence highlights the availability and the proliferation of aircraft in rapidly industrializing Labrador. One notable runway is by the Ashwaubenon River, and it was connected to Ross Bay Junction. That's where the railway going north to Shefferville split off to the spur that connects Labrador west. I did some surveying of that this past summer, and I recorded several concrete footings, buried water lines, bases for fuel tanks. This is surprising since people I talked to didn't remember buildings being there. And they were not present on a 1969 aerial photograph. And even the artifacts too suggest that this is pretty early stuff. One notable find was this cache of metal cans and glass bottles. The small glass bottles had cubic centimeter measurements along the side, and from the base you can tell that it was made by the Dominion Glass Company in Point St. Charles near Montreal in November-December of 1944. That is really interesting and unusual, and this makes me speculate that this was kind of war surplus that was part of this massive movement of people and equipment to build the railroad in '54, and along with the aircraft and the Air Force pilots who flew those aircraft. And while this hasn't been really part of my study, kind of the presence of the military, be it through material culture or the people involved or the economic and the geopolitical importance of the mines or the resources, is really a common thread that runs through all of my case studies, mostly because they're often, I think, located in kind of these border regions, which is something I need to start wrestling with. Another site I surveyed was Daigle Bay, which is north of Labrador City and Wabush and north of the mining operations. This is the only well-preserved survey camp in this area. It existed from spring to fall of 1958. So that's a very narrow window. And is one of the foundational kind of settler sites of this particular part of the province, which I think is important in and of itself. Objects recorded, electrical components, and what actually looks like to be like one of those old sardine cans. There, you still can see the runway. You can see it on Google Satellite. But then there's also a couple of roads and some clearings where there were tents. There are some tent fragments right there. And my favorite object was this can, which after some very quick photo editing turned out to be Marvelube engine oil from Esso, which is kind of cool. But in the future, it will also be really interesting to see, well, how much chemical contamination is there in the soil, even at this kind of short-lived site? Finally, I want to talk about the power station of Twin Falls, which is what happens when a day trip turns into a side project, which then you have to incorporate into your research. That's the powerhouse, as seen here behind my colleague, James Williamson, who is a PhD candidate in archaeology here at Memorial, and more recently, the new GIS tech for the Venovcevs government. So, Twin Falls was one of the first industrial communities in Western Labrador, built around the power plant, which supplied electricity to Lab West. It started producing power in 1962. It stopped in 1972, when Churchill Falls came online. The houses were dismantled or moved to Churchill Falls, while the power plant, the intake station, and the spillway were mothballed into abandonment. I first visited the site in 2019 with Jordan Brown, and this is how it looked. This is one of the main streets running through the settlement. Those alders are taller than me, and I'm 188 centimeters. Alders have been my life. If anyone has some good alder literature, send it to me, I would be interested. It's seriously. So this is why a drone was needed, expertly piloted by James. The drone allowed us to look above the canopy and document the structural remains of, or their absence in the community. This included the Pill Hill work camp, as well as the settlement area In total, we documented 9 foundations, and what was also interesting is that it's kind of hard to see, but there was crop marks. There was different elevations among the alders, which allowed us to to see the road and some of the structures. And all of this is useful to get a better sense about the life and the afterlife of Twin Falls. And this is also a place that has a lot of importance for Labradorians, both indigenous and settler. It's unique because it had a large indigenous workforce recruited mostly from Northwest River, Happy Valley, Hopedale, and Cartwright. And and there are a few accounts in them days, and they have a fantastic collection of photos. So there's a lot of potential here for more memory work, but also how to compare how people's memories line up with the things themselves of what Twin Falls is today. So I visited each of the concrete foundations that documented by the drone, and had a closer look at the surfaces. And and they were all kind of different, and some of them had this capture of bolts and nuts and screws and machine tags from General Electric. Some of them were burned down. This is the pump house, and it had lots of melted lead and glass and charcoal and nails right on top of it. And some were fairly clean. But what was really interesting about this, and I don't know if you can see them, but there's these faint outlines of black squares, tiles, asbestos tiles. And also walls. You can see like big thicker lines. So you have these kind of ghostly after image, and I don't know nearly enough. Actually, I don't know anything about chemistry, so if anyone can explain why this is happening, please tell me. I'd love to know. So we also use kind of ground-based and drone photography to better get 3D models of the standing structures. There's kind of the intake station and the spillway, and kind of the 3D modeling has been done by James. And also just included the shot of the former flooded reservoir. The pictures do not do it justice for this really interesting post-flooded landscape. Finally, being archaeologists, we had to dig a few holes. Just 2, we were conservative. And the material recovered was small pieces of glass, nails, bathroom ceramic, but there was also this, which is a metal disc with what looks like asbestos insulation accreted to it. That was that was really exciting to find, but also exciting in a bad way. I took some soil samples and I've sent them to Tromsø for kind of soil analysis just to see what we're dealing with. But their entire time here was mediated by very kind of visceral interactions with toxicity, be it asbestos coming out of our excavation units to PCBs being just downstream from the power plant, which actually there was a big spill there when the plant was running, and then also signs that warning us of PCBs, dioxins, furans, stuff like that. So this work has opened up more questions for me, especially how to conduct archaeological field work, maybe even archaeological excavation within toxic environments, which is something I'd love to continue doing in the future. And also there's a question about kind of this connection between people's memories, people's nostalgia of the place, and kind of the toxic residues of the settlement. More pertinent to my PhD is kind of what I find is kind of the connections between Twin Falls, which is a mothballed power plant, and the Sydvaranger mine in Norway, which is a mothballed mine. This gets me to my final topic, which is where I'm going to go from here. And looking several months down the road, I think there is kind of potential of seeing, looking at Twin Falls, which was mothballed to the point where it's kind of an economic and environmental liability, and the Sidvaranger mine, which is mothballed, but there's hope that it will not be. And explore like what happens in that state kind of uncertainty. Closer at hand than what I'll be working for the next 2 months while I'm here is on the topic of waste, which is great to be here because there's so many wonderful people doing waste. This is particularly mine waste, which is all around Kirkenes and Bjornavatten. There's plenty of examples, waste rock tailings, the pipe that used to go straight into the fjord and dump all the waste there, but also iron pellets, which are one of the tradable commodities on the iron market, but the pellet plant in Kirkenes was demolished a few years ago, so this is no longer a valuable commodity. This is also waste. But also waste can be thought kind of in a general sense as kind of fluid and a non-local object. And this is particularly useful for Lab West, where I can just walk into a mine. They're still active. But you can they can be looked obliquely like the dust and the noise pollution, which are and have been for many decades ongoing problems, or how or for example, other like pieces of abandoned and wasted infrastructure, like the former floatplane dock, which actually there's a couple of those, and kind of what they become. And the docks and actually the other outlying areas also allowed me to study them closer, because the question I had is like, well, what kind of waste does a mining town produce? So I surveyed them. I walked up and down at 1 meter intervals, photographing every single thing I found. It took me a couple of days. There was a lot of litter. In total, there was 740 objects in just one area that was about 2,000 square meters. And the stuff that it produced was what you might expect. I mean, McDonald's and Bud Light and Tim Hortons and cannabis products and other smoking products. Yet, among all of these objects, there was one iron pellet. Now, iron pellets get regularly shipped out of the mine in Labrador City, but there's also kind of a faint scatter of them. I mean, they can get into clothing, they can get into vehicles, and you kind of, if you look down when you're walking around Lab City and Wabush, you'll see a few. But what's interesting is the connection of the iron pellet, one iron pellet in relationship to everything else. It highlights how, one is how the boundaries, how the boundaries of the mine, are dissolved with this scatter of objects and infrastructure and whatever. But in the survey also it highlights that the presence of an iron pellet highlights specifically what is not there. The mountains and the landscapes that have been harvested for the last 60 years. And while in its place came the houses and the infrastructure and the litter and everything else I've talked about so far. So there's kind of a material substitution between kind of local landscapes that get shipped out and traded for kind of all too familiar objects from kind of a global economy, creating a homogenized, placeless assemblage that kind of characterizes life under global capitalism. So this is what, I'm still working on this. I'm still working on a lot of stuff, and I know I threw a lot of pictures at you guys and a lot of thoughts. So I'm going to shut up now. Now you know what I'm doing, you know what I did. And I'll again conclude by thanking you all, thank you for listening, thank you all for all of those who will watch the video later. And I'd like to thank, again, for having me back here at the Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador. And I'll welcome any comments, suggestions, and questions you all might have. Thank you.
Any questions, comments, suggestions? I have one. Do capitalists and communists colonize in the same way?
Yes and no. One person that inspires me a lot is Kate Brown. She's a historian, I believe MIT, but I might be wrong. She wrote many great books. One of them is Plutopia, I highly recommend. But earlier on, there's an old article from like 2001 where it's like, why does Montana look like Kazakhstan? And there she says that like the differences between kind of what happened in, well, in her case, the United States and the Soviet Union is not kind of differences in kind, it's differences in scope. So there's many, there's many similarities that I've kind of listed and went through, but there's just much more of it in the former Soviet Union. And when you kind of read the histories, it's also like way more people. That was the one big resource that unfortunately the Soviet Union had, especially early on because of the Gulag, but even later on because there was just more bodies to do it. So you don't get the same mechanization that you get here, and you can see it. I mean, you can see it in the runways. You don't really get the runways in Russia. There's a lot of rail, but not so much with that. So, Aaron?
Yeah, I mean, Paul Josephson also talks about that, right? With the idea of the way that North American and Soviet transformations of nature, particularly in the 20th century, were driven by brute force technologies. And that's why you still, the mega dam on the Columbia River in America is the same as the mega dam in northern Labrador, and is the same as the mega dam flooding traditional territories in the Soviet Union. And industrial technologies like mining, milling, and have many of the same kinds of environmental impacts, whether it's the Washoe smelter in Montana or the nickel smelter in the Kola Peninsula. So yeah, there's definitely parallels there. But that's not what I was going to ask. I wanted to bring the conversation back around to heritage, right? Because it's one of the interests that unites geographers and archaeologists, although maybe with slightly different modes of engagement with that. But I'm thinking more at the landscape than the artifact level, although the artifacts are certainly very interesting, whether they're junk or whether they're heritage, the usual debates I'm sure archaeologists have. But I was thinking about looking at sort of Twin Falls and Sortavaranga, and thinking a little bit about what would it mean to treat those places as heritage. We think of heritage as an exercise in preservation or conservation and or interpretation, but there's also this kind of movement a la Caitlin DeSilve, who I know you interact with, around arrested decay, or whether or not indeed to arrest that decay and allow it to kind of continue, while also seeing that process of decay as part of the heritage of the place. So how are these kind of new school ways of thinking about heritage, particularly in relation to, I guess, landscape scale heritage or sites or complex artifacts like the ones like, say, a generating station or an abandoned mine facility of some kind?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So it's very interesting with Sortavaranga, as as soon as and I went through like all of the back issues of Sortavaranga Avis, the Sortavaranga newspaper, and kind of tracing what's the discourse between going on, especially with relationship to the piles of waste rock, to tailings, and it's not until the shutdown of the mine in '97, it's like that there's, well, first it's a threat. It's like, oh my God, look at all the stuff that's left behind. And then it's like, oh, but is this heritage? Can this be heritage? Should they protect this stuff? I was like, yeah, how do we, but then, and there was actually a suggestion from I believe the head archaeologist in Finnmark County, which is the county in which Sorvarand is on, about treating the waste stockpiles as heritage. And people were like, oh, no, that's stupid. And that sort of kind of faded, and now, I mean, there's more about, well, how do we, look, maybe we can monetize this, let's crush it up for gravel. There's limits to that because all the rocks is intermixed, and it's really difficult. And same for, Twin Falls. I mean, I think, and I would think there's a very strong argument to be made why Twin Falls is important from kind of a traditional heritage sense. And I think that's outlined really clearly. But what should we do with it? It's been slated to be demolished, but it's way too expensive. Restoring it for a tourist attraction, which would be nice, but would also probably cost as much as the demolition, if not more. So I think now there's kind of a shift by saying, like, well, this is heritage, whether we like it or not, because it's way too expensive to do anything with it. In like a big transformative sense, it's there. It's there to do, to do something. We have to live with it. So now there's kind of questions of like, well, what does living with heritage mean? And that might be a more and more pertinent question when we start getting more ruins and wondering, well, how do we make life in kind of this stuff that cannot just be turned into a tourism attraction or a nice landscape or something like that.
I also follow-up question on that, because you did put the UNESCO definition that it has something to do with future generations. So I'm curious whether in the kind of study you do you have any input from future generations about what they like to be passed on to them?
Well, the time machine did not actually, it's a little bit over my budget. I mean, I guess we can speculate what future generations might like. And that's something I've been kind of, and it's difficult too, right? I mean, especially like I'm very much aware of my involvement here as an outsider. I cannot speak for Labrador West, I cannot speak for Russia, I mean, I cannot speak for Sorvaranga. But, I mean, I think one way is to look at what kind of people there are saying, and sometimes it's, actually all the time it's interesting, but specifically I'm kind of reminded of the recent art exhibition by Tanya Hayes here at the Rooms Workhorse. And Tanya Hayes is from Labrador City, and that exhibit was really interesting because it is her home and her former workplace, and there is nostalgia, but there's also an awareness of kind of the heavy heritage of industry and kind of many of the negative impacts that come with it. So, and there's no resolution in that. There's no resolution that works. There's a tension that persists of, well, this, yes, this is it, but this is home, and how do you work with that? I mean, I can also speculate on myself, and as somebody who is, actually we can all speculate about it because we're all part of this. We're all part of the Anthropocene, there is no outside. And I've had a lot of personal reflections on this too, right? And then especially in my family, also from Latvia, and their experiences and in industrialization and in colonialism. And I'm still trying to work out. There's a lot of complicated feelings. There's a lot of rage actually of being thrown into a reality that's not really that great. But then rage is not the most productive emotion. So what happens afterward?
Well,
I'm wondering if you thought about learning opportunities in this work for like ongoing resource extractive communities, and kind of like changing the narrative from humans being destroyers to humans being caretakers. What sort of opportunities there are for that in the present moment?
That's an interesting question. No, I have not thought about that. Though, I mean, it is. I mean, I think that's mostly calls for a worldview shift, an ontological shift.
Maybe it's like a different question.
Yeah, but it's. I mean, that is kind of the hope for the future, I guess, or the present. You know, and like in these places, I mean, they're still, I mean, they're built around resource extraction, and when you look at the surveys that's been conducted, I mean, and Russia's a really clear example where there's the single industrial towns in Russia are a huge problem when you have like something like 30 million people in Russia live in single industrial towns. So there's been a lot of work on that, and you know, but survey after survey after survey has shown that now instead of like when you ask Russians living in these places, like, well, what do you want to see? What do you want to like? How would you want to like diversify or get away from industry? Or well, their response is more industry. That's a really dark perspective. But then, yeah. So I mean, I guess a lot of the things that I have seen about like living after extraction has sort of been involuntary. I mean, there's an amazing and really large abandoned quartzite quarry outside of Monchegorsk, and now it's cottage country, and people are like drawing water from the old the old crater that was mined out and stuff like that. So I'm like, oh, this is so. You know, like making home in ruins is what I've mostly been seeing. So.
wonderful. Well, join me in thanking Anatolijs for a great presentation. The seminar is off next week. We'll be back on October 15th with Dr. Paul Benahana J from Social Work, who's going to present on So Often Against Us, Blacks, Migration, and Canada's History. Cool. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks, guys. Guessing responses?
Yes, thank you.